Today is Tuesday. All right?
Right.
It's still dark, so I don't know which day it is. So it's Tuesday. It is Chav Vov Tevis Tovshin Ayin Gimel, and we are in Teres Menachem Sefer HaMa'amorim Tovshin Yud Aleph Tovshin Yud Beis in the Mamar of Shabbos Parshas Shmini, Parshas Porah of Tovshin Yud Aleph, Vayedaber Hashem al Moshe Zos Chukas Hatorah, and we are in the middle of Ois Gimel, chapter 3, on page Nun Beis. We are in the middle of learning about Rotzav Hashev, ebb and flow, going out, leaving and returning. And we were discussing what causes this phenomenon of Rotzav Hashev, of leaving and returning, in all of creation and in the Chayes Elokih, the godly energy that sustains creation. And the Rebbe explained that there are two things that are necessary for there to be a permanent state of Rotzav Hashev. One is, first of all, the fact that the life force, the energy, is a ha'ara, an emanation from its source. But that's not enough for the godly life force, for the godly energy, to have this mode, this dual mode of Rotzav Hashev, of leaving and returning. In addition to that, it has to feel its source. It has to feel its source and has to cleave to its source. And once it feels its source and cleaves to its source, then when it's out of its source, it feels, I don't really belong here, I want to return. I want to go back to my original state. And once it comes back to its source, it feels my source wants me to come back and to illuminate and to give life to the creatures outside of it. That is why, that I've explained, in the neshama, in the conscious neshama, the nefesh ruach neshama dimension of our soul, right? The part of the neshama, the part of the soul that clothes itself in the body, there isn't this permanent state of Rotzav Hashev, of leaving and returning. Why? Because it does not feel its source permanently, constantly. And in order to affect the conscious soul, the conscious part of the soul, the nefesh ruach neshama part of the soul, with Rotzav Hashev, you need avodah v'yigia. You need to work very hard. That's where we're up to.
So what are the two things we need? Avodah.
In order for there to be Rotzav Hashev, it needs to be of its source, an emanation from the source. But in addition to that, once it does become in a state of emanation, once it becomes an entity outside of its source, so to speak, it needs to feel and cleave to its source. And that causes the Rotzav Hashev. So the neshama, the nefesh ruach neshama, as we said, the neshama is divided into two aspects to the neshama. There is the chaye yechida dimension of the soul, which is like, let's call it with the general term, the essence of the soul, which is constantly connected to Hashem, consciously, and is aware of it, and cleaves to it, and so on and so forth, to godliness. Therefore, that is in a state of Rotzav Hashev, whereas the conscious dimension of the soul as it closes itself in the body, which is nefesh, ruach, neshama, that is not in a constant state of Rotzav Hashev for the reasons just mentioned. So this is as it is in neshamas. We find a similar phenomenon in spheres, that there is an aspect of the sphera. In the divine attributes, we also find this idea that there is an aspect of the sphera, of the attribute, which is in a permanent state of Rotzav Hashev because it is aware and cleaving and so on and so forth. And there's an aspect that is not. That's where we're up to. So we're on page Nun Beis, and we are about 10 lines from the top, at the full stop. I'm sorry. No, it's not 10 lines from the top. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines from the top. The line starts with the word v'yigia. Right? So, similarly, we also find concerning the divine lights and the divine vessels, which means to say the two components that make up the spheres, the divine attributes, Generally, when we talk about Eidos V'Kelim, when we talk about Spheres, without referring to any specific realm, we're talking about Atzilus. Okay, the very highest of the realms. So similarly, when we talk about the lights and the vessels of that make up the two components that make up the divine attributes of Atzilus, the lights which are in a mode of obvious cleaving, they are in this mode of leaving and returning. Not so the vessels, which are not in the mode of cleaving, obvious cleaving to their source. On their own, they are not in a mode of leaving and returning. It's just that the light that shines in them, that clothes itself in them, in the vessels, reveals in them that they should be in the mode of leaving and returning. Very briefly, the Rebbe, when he refers to the Eidos, when he refers to the lights, he says that they are in a mode of obvious cleaving, whereas the vessels are not. What does that mean? Eidos, the lights of the Spheres, is, as we know, is rooted in Ein Sof. If you go back to before the Tzimtzum, before the initial contraction, you're talking about, let's use the other terminology, it's the Eir HaBli Gvul. It's rooted in God's ability, unlimited ability to give. The Kelim come from where? They stem from where? From the Reshimu. From the impression that's left after the contraction. The first contraction. Meaning to say, it is the revelation of God's power to limit. So the Eir is the revelation of God's power to give in an unlimited way. The Kelim are a revelation of God's power to limit.
And when do they separate?
They separate at the Tzimtzum. The contraction causes that separation.
So they separate into Kelim and light at the Tzimtzum?
Well, not yet Kelim, but as two distinct powers. When we talk about Hashem's unlimited ability, it's beyond limitation and it's beyond non-limitation. Right? It's beyond limitness. It's beyond limit and beyond being unlimited. Right? It's beyond everything. So in other words, he encapsulates everything. He has everything. Through the Tzimtzum, this is where you begin to define these two modes as two distinct entities. They come even more defined in Eidos and Kelim of Atzilus, but still not as defined as they are in Bria. Once you come into Bria, where you have this idea of creation, over there you have even an actual distinct entity which is separate, which is limited, and so on and so forth. But I want to go to this, explain this point of Dveikus Nikeres and Dveikus Bilti Nikeres. Right? They're both emanations from Hashem's power, from Hashem, right? From beyond the Tzimtzum. However, when we talk about an ability to give, an ability to reveal, what's Eir? That Eir is the idea of revealing. Revealing what? Its source. In other words, the Eir contains nothing in it other than the fact that it's there to reveal its source. So when you look at it, it's obvious that it cleaves to its source. By definition, it has to appear in a way that it's obviously cleaving to its source. That's the whole idea of Eir. Whereas when we talk about Kelim, because Kelim is the power to limit, the way they emanate from their source is in a cleaving which is not obvious. The example that's used in Chassidus is the difference between a flame, a coal that burns with a flame, as opposed to a spark. They both come from the same place, but this is obviously connected to its source, and the spark is not. In fact, this is if you look in the Tanya, in Igeres HaKedesh, I believe, I think it's chapter 20, he quotes an expression from the Tikkun Zohar, Ihu v'chayohi chad, Ihu v'garmohi chad. He and his chayohi, which means his emanations, his life-giving emanations, Eiros, are one, and he and his causations, I believe that it's translated as, or his organs, are one. Which means the Kalim. So we're talking about Ein Sof and the Eiris are one, and Ein Sof and the Kalim are one. However, you say it in two separate chads. The chad, the oneness, is different in the chayohi, and the chad is different in the garmohi. In other words, the dveikis, the cleaving, is different between one or the other. Why? Because one is obviously connected and cleaving, the other one is not. Right? So that's why the Eiris, that's what he says over here. The Eiris, the divine emanations of light, are in an obvious state of cleaving, therefore they are constantly in the mode of Ratzav Hashov. Because they have, of leaving and returning, because they not only are emanations from their source, they are cleaving to their source, and they feel their source. Whereas the Kalim are designed at the outset, at the core, to be connected to the source in a non-obvious way. And therefore they do not possess it on their own. They would not possess this mode of Ratzav Hashov, permanent leaving and returning. It's when the Eiris, when the divine lights come into the Kalim to operate through them, because they possess this idea of Ratzav Hashov in them, the Eiris, leaving and returning, they affect the Kalim to be in the same way. That's the point we're making. That's number one. The Eitzais, another reason, She'in Yizeh. He says an additional thing, an additional point. This idea that the vessels on their own are not in the mode of leaving and returning, this is an additional reason for the fact that the light does have this mode of leaving and returning. Until now we said that the reason why there is the leaving and returning is because it feels its source. Right? Here he says that the fact that the Eir comes into an environment that does not possess the leaving and returning, that's an additional cause for the Eir to have the leaving and returning mode. Why? The key
or not.
Sorry?
Or not. Because the caving could conceal.
Hang on. Let's see how he articulates it. What's the effect of a light which is completely connected and totally, its entire being is there to reveal its source? What happens to, how does it react when it comes into an environment which conceals, which does not possess it? That's the point.
Right.
The key when since the vessels do not possess on their own this mode of leaving and returning, then in this sense they are an opposite force to the light. That's why the light is in the mode of leaving. It's almost like it's being rejected. It's like, I don't belong here. What's going on over here? So what happens now when, so the light leaves, comes back to its source, and the source says, you got to go back. The whole purpose of your emanation is to illuminate your environment, to give life. So what happens when it comes back? In what way is the Eir present, is the light present in the Keli? So therefore also when it returns, when the light is drawn back down in the mode of returning to clothe itself in the vessel, since he comes, and the word that Rebbe used in Yiddish is, because the Rebbe spoke originally in Yiddish, treft on, since he meets, he hits, he comes into contact, it's something which is, something which is opposite to it, the Eir cannot be in a mode of actual, complete settlement. Why? Because it feels it's not in its natural environment. It's in an environment which opposes its nature. That's number one. V'gam, in addition to the fact that it can't be completely settled in the keli, in the vessel, in addition to that, this settlement is only temporary. Because it's constantly feeling, I don't belong here. So that causes it to rush out again. So this is the core, another additional dimension in causing the energy to leave, and then being told, come back, and then again, leaves again, and back and forth permanently.
And that only applies to the light, to the whole.
That's an Eiris. Hang on a second. Same thing is in the Neshama. Ukmei beguf neshama. in the body and in the soul, it's even more pronounced. Eidus and kelim are what? Lights and vessels are what? In Atzilus, you're not talking about Yesh Ma'ayin. The Keli is not Yesh Ma'ayin, it's still Gilei HaHelam. It's revealing God's power to the limit, but it's godliness. When we say Iyu v'chayei yichad, Iyu v'garmei yichad, he and his lights are one, and he and his causations are one, and he and his life-giving emanations are one, and he and his causations are one. When we talk about causations, you're saying it's one with Elikus. It's Elikus. It's godliness. And if there you have this idea that the causations possess a nature which is contrary, in this sense, to the nature of the emanation of the light, Allah has kama v'kama, when we talk about what? How much more so when we talk about the body and the soul? Because the body relative to the soul is mamash yesh. It's completely a different limit. It's a limiting power, a limiting entity. Just like when we talk about the body and the soul, the kivan shem shnei hofchim, since they are two opposites, because the soul is chelik elakam mal mamish, the soul is godliness, and the guf is a gashmi, is physical. The kivan shem shnei hofchim, since they are two opposites, how then do the body and the soul connect? It's only by God's wonderful power to be able to combine two opposites. Really and truly and naturally, they are not combinable. They can't coexist. Therefore, also, when we talk about the life-giving force of the soul in the body, is in the mode of leaving and returning. Right?
No.
Why?
Because you just said at the beginning
that it's not.
that it's not.
Okay, so it depends what we're talking about. There's the nefesh elokis.
Right.
Then there is there's the godly soul, but then you have the soul that gives life, physical life to the body.
So at death, the soul departs.
Completely.
And this is the returning, the
No,
shuv.
we're talking about in life.
Yes,
That while the person is alive, the life-giving force. What gives the body life? Which neshama gives that body physical life? The nefesh habamis. By a yid, the nefesh elikis and the godly soul and the animal soul unite as one, right? But we're talking about the life-giving soul that gives life to the body. Physical life. We're not talking about being connected to Hashem in avodas Hashem. Simple physical life, just like an animal. Sorry? Yeah. So that part of the soul, in the sense of life-giving energy, it's just like any other life-giving energy that has this mode of rotzav v'shev, right? Otherwise, as we explained before, it would not be able to give life. It has to feel its source, right? So this is what he's talking about over here. So therefore, we find that also in the life-giving energy of the body and the soul. He's talking about, as he says very clearly, right? We're talking about the aspect of the soul which combines with the body to give its physical life, and that is it's a phenomenon that only Hashem can bring about because they're opposites. So it causes the physical life-giving energy, the energy that gives, the divine energy that gives physical life, to be in the mode of Ratzav Hashem, because it comes down into an environment that's hostile to it.
When we speak about the 5 levels,
Let me just finish a few lines to finish the Eis. Okay? Similarly, when we talk about the divine emanations and the vessels, since the vessels are what? Opposites of the lights, in the sense that what? That the divine lights are of the luminary, and they are obviously connected, and obviously and directly connected, and they feel their source, whereas the kelim do not. Therefore, the drawing down of the lights into the vessels is in this mode of leaving and returning. And the leaving and returning that's within the lights, the divine lights, that also reveals within the kelim, within the vessels, when it arrives in them, that they too should possess this. It activates this concept of Ratzav Hashem, this idea, the mode of Ratzav Hashem, leaving and returning, also in the kelim.
So the kelim also can feel the Ratzav Hashem.
Yes, but it needs an activator. Similar to what we said before, the conscious level of the nefesh elikis, the nefesh haruch neshama, could have Ratzav V'Shev. It doesn't have it on its own, right? But for that you need to work with the soul, with the conscious level of the soul, in order to reveal within it the Ratzav V'Shev, the leaving and returning. Sorry, you were asking about the 5 levels.
I'm unclear on the relationship of the aspects of the soul which vitalize the body, the nefesh elokis, with regard to those as two separate entities and their relationships of Orim or Kalim, and in the context of what we're learning.
Okay, so we have like this. When we talk about Oidus V'Kalim, we're talking about God's divine energy to give and God's divine energy to conceal. The example of that template in the body and the soul is the life-giving soul, the soul that sustains, that gives physical life to the body, that causes the body to live. It's got nothing to do with Nefesh Elokis, right?
Does it have 5 levels? It must have.
Well,
because this zeh u'umat zeh.
Okay, yes, I mean,
So
but
if it's got 5 levels,
but here we're talking about physical life. Forget about the levels now for a second. Forget it. That's another aspect of it. That's the Zeh Zeh aspect of it, right? The Nefesh Abamis possesses the 5 levels because it needs to have Zeh Zeh. But you could imagine a soul without the 5 levels. Imagine a soul that just gives life. The point that he's trying to make is this. He's trying to bring...
It has got, like, the Nefesh HaSichlis is the aspect of the...
Correct. But we're not
the
talking...
Neshama parallel.
We're not talking about the Nefesh Abamis mirroring the Nefesh Elokis for the purposes of Chira and for the purposes of serving Hashem. He's trying to make a point here. He's trying to explain the reasons for Ratzav V'Shev. Why does the light possess this mode? Why is it in this mode of leaving and returning? So the first reason he gave was because it feels its source. Right? It's of its source and it feels its source. Right? Now he's adding a point. It's not only because of its source, it's also because of where it comes to, where it illuminates. So he says, what does it mean? When energy, whose entire being is something which is of its source and is constantly and permanently connected to its source, because of which it could have the qualities of a life-giving energy, when it comes into an environment which is hostile to it, which is opposite to its character, it causes it to leave.
And that is the Keli.
That's the Keli. To give an example for that, he says it's mostly pronounced where? In a neshama and a guf. Why? Because a body is a physical body, a lifeless body, is as opposite to a life-giving energy that you can get. That's the point that he's making. Therefore, when you talk about Oidus and Kalim, but Kalim is much less pronounced. Why? Because as we mentioned before, Garmoihi, the Kalim of Atzilis, the vessels of Atzilis, are godliness. They're not dead. They're a godly power. Right? They're with all
there should be less lots of the shop there.
Correct. That's the point that he's making. It's mostly pronounced in the guf and the neshama. But similarly, when we talk about Oidus and Kalim of Atzilis, because the Oir comes to a Keli and it's a limiting power, and the Dveikis, it's the way the Keli cleaves to its source is not nikir, is not obvious. Therefore, because it's obviously much more sensitive there, the Oir, the divine light of Atzilis, when it comes in contact with the Keli, it feels there's something here that's not natural to me. It causes it to want to leave. That's the point that he's making.
That's a paradox, because the light needs the Keli to be able to express itself.
Absolutely.
It is, and therefore you have this huge paradox and wanting, in a way, to needing to be there.
Absolutely.
And also not being able to be there.
Absolutely. But it's only when you have this mode. What's the point that he's trying to make? The point that he's trying to make is that ultimately you need in order for existence to exist in the right way, in a balanced way, in the right way, where you don't become too spiritual, but on the other hand you don't mutate into something which is so far and disconnected from the source. You need this constant tension, this constant leaving and returning, and therefore when we look at creation, I mean, we're not, if we look at it ourselves, we're not in the constant mode of expiring. We don't die and become alive at every moment. This is life. This is what makes up life as we know it. What? this idea of constantly the energy, having the life-giving force, feeling that it needs to return, meaning being constantly connected to its source, and at the same time, being in an environment to give life.
At night when we go to sleep, the soul departs from the body, returns to its source.
Correct. But not completely. But you're right that in other words, there are grades in Rotzav Hashev. Sleeping and waking is Rotzav Hashev, absolutely. In the broader sense. Then you have breathing when you're awake and when you're sleeping. The inhaling and exhaling is also Rotzav Hashev. So you'll find this.
But different breathing is not connected with the soul as such, in the same way as when we go to sleep at night and the soul departs from the body.
But correct. But the difference between a living person and a person that's not alive is
No breath.
no breath. The breath of life. So it's a template. It's an idea that exists at every level.
Okay, so where's the strong connection in breathing with the source? Where's the aura in connected with the source in breathing?
The point is that breathing represents another manifestation, another example of drawing in life, the life being drawn in, and the life being expended. Okay, so like I said, the heart contracts and expands. A child, before it's born, the lungs are completely collapsed. As soon as the child is born, it opens up. So you find this in all, again and again and again. This is the template of life. This is the blueprint of life. The footprint of life.